Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. The podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to discuss ongoing diversity programming with our member institutions as well as the larger veterinary profession. My name is Lisa Greenhill, and I'm the Senior Director for Institutional Research and Diversity at AAVMC. I am very excited about today's show. Today is the last, this is the last show of 2017, and we have a total rock star guest for you today. So today's show is about institutional change, diversity, and inclusion, and I am delighted to welcome Dr. Christine Stanley, Vice President and Associate Provost for Diversity Emerita at Texas A&M University. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you.
I'm so excited to have you on the show. I am a total groupie. That I'm very excited. This season, I've had like two of my favorite Chiros on the podcast. So I'm really, really excited. So thank you so much for making time to come on today's show.
Absolutely.
So as I mentioned, we are talking about institutional change and how to drive change related to diversity and inclusion at the colleges of veterinary medicine or at your individual site of employment or practice. So before we get started, I'd love for Dr. Stanley to share a little bit about her background and where she's been and what she's doing and what she's done. So Dr. Stanley.
So I'll try to be brief. So I'm Jamaican American. I grew up in Jamaica, emigrated to the United States in 1980. So I've been here quite a while. I'm a naturalized citizen. I've worked at two land-grant research universities, the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio from 1990 to 1999, and returned back to Texas A&M in the fall of 1999 on the faculty. So when I say returned back, to Texas A&M. This is where I did my graduate work, did my PhD here in 1990, and did my undergraduate work at Prairie View A&M University, which is a historically Black college. It's part of the Texas A&M University system. So it's like coming home back to Texas. I guess you want me to focus on a little bit on my recent role for 8 years and 2 months, but who's counting, as Vice President Associate Provost for Diversity from 2009 to 2017. And I'm also a tenured full professor in the College of Education and Development, where I've returned now. Very exciting to re-engage in research issues again, or as a colleague of mine said, geez, you never really left. But as far as diversity and inclusion and change, I believe, Lisa, when you and I talked about this podcast, you wanted me to talk a little bit about some of the changes that I've seen in my time here at A&M. Actually, I've observed quite a few. You know, looking back over the years, even when I was a graduate student here and now on the faculty and as an administrator, one of the things that I have seen here that we've been able to document and assess using a very ambitious diversity plan that was vetted and approved in 2010. And what I've experienced and know about change as it relates to diversity and inclusion efforts is that it takes time. I mean, if we're talking about universities, which are like systems, and it requires accountability at various levels, whether we're talking about the chancellor, the president, the provost, the dean, the department chair or head, faculty, staff, and students, and numerous other university stakeholders. And I think it's probably naive to think that any one person entitled leadership for diversity and inclusion efforts has a sole responsibility for change. So seeing a lot of changes over the years. Are we there yet? No, you know, but hopefully we're learning from those changing and learning from our continued challenges and paving the way forward. And we can point to various units on campus that have really, really made a difference and have really encompassed deep change. And one of them actually is our own College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences here at A&M. I can't say enough about that college and some of the things that they've accomplished there under the leadership of Eleanor Green and Kenita Rogers.
Great. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the kind of maybe strategies for driving change? You have this university plan, so you kind of know where you want to go. What are some of the things that worked for you in terms of helping people understand what the big goal is and getting them to kind of share that vision and move in that direction?
One of the things that I think has been a key lever in our diversity efforts, at least from my view, and I had a ha-ha moment about maybe 2 years ago when I came across an article, and I would highly recommend it. The person who wrote the article, the piece, is Joseph Simplicio, Simplicio, and his basically Joseph Simplicio was writing about his understanding of a university's culture. And so the aha moment that I had was, is really getting to understand the university culture, which I think is one of the key change levers. Our universities are guardians of the culture. I mean, if we talk about veteran faculty members, staff members, and others at the institution who have a lot of longevity and seniority, who stand sometimes and watch over the status quo, if you will. And many of these individuals, sometimes when change efforts are initiated, don't always move at the pace that you would like. And especially when you're talking about change that affects people's values and beliefs sometimes, it points for a complex mix for leadership. So what I've learned from my 16 years in university administration and 8 of that as vice president for diversity is that you have to understand and work with the university's culture. And another key change lever is individual leadership. I can't say that enough. And given the divisiveness, behavior, and attitude that we're seeing in our country right now in the world, I think we have to own diversity and inclusion as a moral imperative, as a key to recognizing and managing conflict. And I don't think it's enough to be a bystander or remain silent in non-threatening situations where you can respond or act. And I think another key change lever is also institutional policies and procedures, looking for areas where sometimes our espoused rhetoric about valuing diversity and inclusion do not always align with our institutional artifacts.
So that's the piece on policies and practices, I think, certainly really resonates right now in this moment that we're having. #MeToo and issues around harassment and how do people report, whether they report, how do they report, and how folks find ways of handling those types of situations that are, rooted in so much conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So within that kind of issue of kind of understanding institutional culture, how did you gain buy-in for some of the initiatives that you advanced?
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about, I'm reflecting on this a lot lately, especially since I've returned to the faculty now full-time, is because people have asked me this, and some people have actually said, one of the things that I've noticed in the 8 years that you were in this role, and I've been thinking about this too, and I would offer this, is cultivating strategic relationships on as well as off campus, in terms of building coalitions. And another aha moment that I came across too, and I just finished writing a piece for publication about this, is I'm a strong believer in John Cotter's work on organizational change and the way he frames things around those 8 stages. So, and one of that, he talks about building guiding coalitions. Mm-hmm. So when I say strategic relationships on campus is, working with deans across the colleges, engaging and empowering others to learn from each other and learn from best practice, whether, for example, a College of Veterinary Medicine might benefit from something that's happening in the College of Education or the College of Engineering or the College of Medicine. So building coalitions is very important.
How does that off-campus piece work?
The off-campus piece, funny you should mention that, because the one example that I could think of right off the top of my head is I remember I was 2 years into my role when Eleanor Green called me from the vet school, and she said, Christine, we've got to get this school more diverse than it is. And we have an HBCU within our own system, and I would like to engage in a relationship with them. And someone told me that's your alma mater. Would you be willing to accompany me and members of my leadership team to that campus to meet with the president and the provost? And I said, sure. So we went down to Purview, which is about a 45-minute drive from the College Station campus. And we met with the president, the provost, and some of the deans and some faculty members. And I'll never forget this, because sitting around that conference table during the conversation, one of their faculty members looked at us, and Kenita tells the story too, and she says, yeah, that lady, she just got her finger and she pointed us and she said, why should we send our students to your campus and to study veterinary medicine? Because over the years, we've heard stories in terms of how they were not always treated very well. So you need to treat them well. And so we listened and we had a really good conversation. But I share this story because Kenita and Eleanor came back and they heard it. It didn't get defensive, but they listened. And they worked to build relationships with Purview. Long story short, where I think early this year or last year, our College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences now has an agreement with Purview that they signed off on, to encourage students to come either to the college for graduate school or to apply to vet school. And we've had a couple of students that have come to our College of Veterinary Medicine and were successful and have graduated and are still engaged with the college. So building relationships on and off campus, I think, is one of the key. I think another thing leaders can do too is meeting people, faculty, staff, and students where they are about diversity inclusion. And you're not going to get far for buy-in if you push people in a very confrontational way. So I think those are some of the keys that have been that I've found very successful.
So what are some of those ways that you've engaged faculty and students? Have you had listening sessions or town halls, or what are some of the things that you've done over the years to kind of really find ways of giving individuals voice and really kind of listening to them?
Well, through our diversity plan, which is focused around 3 goals, it's accountability, climate, and equity. I mean, we have 23 units across campus, units being defined as the academic colleges and administrative units that have to submit annual reports every year through my office to the President's Council on Climate and Diversity. So in those annual reports, I get to read and learn about different activities that are occurring across campus, whether it's related to faculty recruitment, faculty retention, staff, and students. And in those reports, as well as conversations with deans and with other administrative leaders on campus, is learning what people are doing more intentionally to engage their units around climate efforts. Some of these may be intern intergroup dialogue. For example, the College of Veterinary Medicine has been very successful in the last couple of years, being very intentional about understanding their conflict management culture. where they have trained faculty and staff in mediation, in conflict management strategies. So they've been very intentional about this because they're really trying to work at changing their culture. So again, different things that are happening across campus. In student affairs, they're getting ready to start modules to engage our student leaders, for example, in terms of those skills. Our president had a retreat, and our former provost, about a year ago, when we were, diversity was one of the items on the agenda, and the deans were there, all the vice presidents, and we had a really deep conversation about some of the things that we need to move forward on if we're really serious about effective change, particularly around policies and procedures.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So we've talked a bit about all of some of the positive things that you can kind of do to kind of cultivate communication and buy-in. One of the things I think that has changed certainly over my short career in this particular space is what pushback looks like. Because I think it looks like different things depending on the group. What are some of the ways that people maybe kind of push back on change in general that you've kind of experienced, but also specific to this type of work?
I think pushback can take many forms. Some people, you can see pushback in the form of disengagement. You see pushback in terms of faculty, staff, and student behaviors that work at odds with institutional diversity efforts. You can see, for example, pushback in terms of expressive activities like what we're seeing with conservative speakers trying to what I would call infiltrate college campuses. And you can see pushback in terms of just leaving diversity efforts to chance, oh, well, that's not my thing. It's not my area of expertise. Somebody else will be taking charge of that. So, and I think you move past the pushback, I think, by working with some degree with the choir, if you will, those already on board. And I think also those who are what I would call the power brokers on campus or power brokers in our college or our departments. And the power brokers are people that I would call those faculty, staff, or administrators who are respected, who people respect and will follow because they're trusted. So I think that's one way of working past the pushback. Our former provost, Karen Watson, addressed the AAVMC Leadership Academy group last week in our college, and her term for power brokers, I believe she calls this the bell cow, the one who other cows in the pasture will follow, if you will. But I think having said all that, I don't get discouraged with pushback. In fact, I expect it to some degree. I mean, if you're leading change efforts, and if you're leading change efforts around diversity and inclusion, as I said earlier, where for a lot of people, some of the issues are at the core of their own personal values and beliefs, expect it to some degree. And to me, if you're not encountering pushback, then I don't think you're leading change, or you're leading it very deeply. So I think that's part of change.
Yeah, sure. So with the big plan that was advanced at Texas A&M, and certainly is still, those efforts are still underway, one of the challenges I think that I hear from our members is defining change. Defining success, rather. What does success look like? In terms of representative diversity, sometimes it's easier for folks to say, well, this is kind of what parity looks like, and when we compare this against our state demographics or national demographics. But how did you and Texas A&M define success? What would success look like?
You know, that's a very interesting question, and I get asked that a lot. And I remember, and here's how I answer it. And I'm not sure I'm going to answer it in a way that's probably sufficient for people who are trying to look for a certain level of precision. So, one of my colleagues in higher ed who studies campus climates across colleges and universities in this country, one of the things that she says is, and I believe this too, is make no mistake, we have to pay attention to our numbers, okay? So we have to look at our numbers, whether we're talking about faculty, staff, and students, and say, we don't look very diverse. And if we're talking about numbers in terms of how universities are federally mandated to keep track of race, ethnicity, and gender, right? So numbers tell us something in terms of diversity, but it's not just the numbers, because it's not just race, ethnicity, and gender. I mean, because we're talking about how human beings define themselves. There's a lot of race, ethnicity, and gender, but intersectionally in terms of class, we're talking about religion, political affiliation, sexual orientation. We're talking about nationality, culture, physical learning ability, and the list goes on and on and on, right? So for me, success is when individuals can come to our institutions and really enjoy and feel a sense of belonging at our institutions, no matter how they define themselves. So for me, that's one measure of success. So essentially, what I'm talking about here, is our campus climate, is our unit climate. So I'm more concerned about if somebody leaves my department or my college and leaves, feeling that they were mistreated, or they had an experience here that made them so unhappy that they would tell people outside of the department or the college, look, I would really consider going to that place, because that place, I was not treated well there. I know there's a lot of variables in terms of all that stuff, but for me, that's one measure of success, how people experience our campus environments, broadly speaking. I think another measure of success is accountability at all layers, and accountability, not just individuals entitled leadership, but our own individual we need to be more accountable for each other and for everyone, and break the silence that's just so, the silence can be so thick sometimes, it's hard to get through. Yeah. So again, I'm not sure if I answered your question precisely, but success, I get asked that. So how do we know we're there? How do we know we've arrived? Are our campuses, if we think the state of Texas, for example, I use our state data, the last census data that I look for the state of Texas, Hispanic Americans in the state of Texas are 38%. African Americans, if we're talking about race and ethnicity, African Americans are 12%. If we look at our institutional data, in terms of those numbers, do we reflect that? No. Will we ever reach that? I don't know, because we're talking about other nuances, like, if we're talking about the undergraduate level, and if we're talking about, students that are college ready coming out of high school, that's a whole nother area there too that we need to trouble some more. So you see what I'm saying? So it's not as easy in terms of defining success. These issues are very complex. So what I say is, when we as institutions can do a better job of creating an organizational climate. I think some of the other things that I mentioned in terms of the numbers, over the years will steadily improve. So that's my answer to that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer. I think that I think that many people working on these issues, diversity and inclusion, are looking for kind of the magic there. Yep. Wherever there is, are we there yet? Yep. Or will we ever get there? And sometimes the answer is, I don't know, it's about the journey. And other times, it may be more clearly or finite definition, or way of kind of seeing, yeah, well, we're closer to wherever that magic there is. So as people are trying to get to the magic there, how do you hold them accountable?
I think one of the things that we have found that seems to be making a difference is one layer of accountability is getting individuals to think about diversity very seriously in terms of how we think about research, how we think about teaching, how we think about serve, which are often the three pillars that most universities use in terms of holding particularly faculty accountable. So within research, teaching, and service, and we talked about this at a president's and dean's retreat a year ago, is how do we hold ourselves accountable for making sure that diversity is taken serious? What are we doing our part? I remember our provost, as I said earlier, about sometimes our espoused values don't always align with our artifacts. So, for example, if I say I want my department to be more diverse along many dimensions, then my question is, then what are we doing that contributes to that or inhibits that? Mm-hmm. If I say that we want more of our veterinary graduates to be able to serve and work in diverse and global settings, then what are we doing in our courses and curricula to realize that goal? And as Carter would say in his research model about organizational change, then where's our sense of urgency to do this? So one layer of accountability is increase getting people to take this more seriously in terms of annual reporting on what they're doing. Another layer of accountability too is policies and practices for faculty. One department in engineering, in fact, it's electrical engineering. You could probably find it on their website. I was pleasantly surprised earlier this year when the provost said to me, take a look at this, where she showed me where faculty in the Department of Electrical Engineering made a decision that on their annual performance evaluations for faculty, that they were going to add diversity as one of the dimensions where faculty are going to be evaluated for. So diversity, in terms of how faculty work in terms of recruiting students in the department, how they retain students, how they recruit other faculty. And in any case, they defined through a conversation amongst themselves what the criteria that they were going to be judged against, if you will, or to be held accountable for. We had a conversation in a president and dean's retreat. I don't know if this is going to come to fruition or not, but we had the conversation about looking at, and again, we're talking about faculty here still, looking at policies and procedures for faculty in terms of what's required for tenure and promotion. Looking at research and looking at teaching. There are faculty that are really working to really do some inclusive things in terms of their courses and curricula. For example, our College of Veterinary Medicine has a cultural competency component that they developed. I mean, so that's one layer in terms of accountability. And some departments are thinking about in terms of how they do admissions procedures. at the departmental level and looking and hold themselves accountable for diversity efforts there. So those are some of the accountability efforts that are happening in some units that I can point to on our campus that might be helpful for others.
Sure, sure. It sounds like with some of that, it is a ground up willingness to kind of hold themselves accountable, not just here's here's the rule, now go do it.
I think it's both. I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, the diversity plan, accountability is one of the pillars, but also, and you're right, some of it too is grounds up, where individuals are really having conversations. So you talked about pushback earlier. So when I was in the position in my office, when I would get a call from a dean or a vice president or a department head or chair, for example, asking me for, well, geez, can you help me with this in my department? I'm thinking about doing X, Y, and Z. One of the things that I would often do is, and I said, okay, if you're thinking about doing this, here's some models that you ought to be aware of. Here's some individuals that can help you to think about that more deeply and whatever, so it's giving leaders and the tools, the resources, that can help them. And one of the accountability efforts that has helped, because faculty see that we're serious about this, is that our diversity plan every year, thanks to our provost and our president, our former provost and our president, who initiated this, is that there's $1 million set aside each year to reward units that are making progress in any areas of the diversity plan.
Oh, well, there's some skin in the game.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly.
So we have a question that was sent in before the show. So I'm going to read the question from one of our institutions. Once an institution has made a commitment to organizational shift towards deepening inclusivity and diversity, what are some practical ways to support and move those forward through policy, particularly policy that mostly impacts faculty and staff, where we see many more resources? There are more resources that are already kind of going towards student programming and how to do that type of thing. So we're really this question is more focused on how do we support and move faculty.
Faculty, myself included, we are an interesting bunch, and we're an interesting, the faculty culture is interesting in the sense that, to get things to move, is engaging people in dialogue. Really engaging in the difficult dialogues around the work that's before us and what it's going to take. And I say that because if you don't have those dialogues and developing a vision together of where you want your department to go with respect to diversity and inclusion, that I don't think you're going to get very far in terms of your efforts. So again, you got to have those difficult dialogues, and then going from there. But I also think, though, starting off with some things that, and Cotter talks about this in terms of celebrating, the short wins, if you will. And a short win, might be coming up, for example, with some guidelines around how we're going to engage with each other in the department to really set a climate of inclusion, for example. Another way too, in terms of getting things done after you've had those dialogues, is really sitting down and said, okay, looking at our department, we have a position opening that's coming up soon. What are we looking for in our next colleague? And how do we make sure that we build a diverse pool of candidates as possible? How do we nurture particularly graduate students who are interested in faculty careers, to really think about faculty or even ones that have moved on to come back to the department after a couple of years. So I'm not sure if that's what the person who's asking, who posed that question, if that's what they meant. But I mean, you have to start incrementally and build things over time. But you got to get buy-in and you got to get ownership. And I think co-creating what you're trying to do is helpful in the long run. My own department a couple of years ago engaged in a retreat setting where faculty and staff primarily work together to come up with, for example, I believe they called it, I think, a diversity inclusion statement for the department. That's now shared publicly, where anybody, you know, who is thinking about joining the department will see that. So I think it's, so again, you know, these things are going to take time, but I would work incrementally and use the power broker if there's one or two or several in the department to engage those individuals in those conversations as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you've referenced the Cotter change model a few times. I'm a huge fan of Cotter myself, and I just kind of wanted to do a quick review for folks that may not be familiar with that change model. There are 8 steps, and they are increased urgency, building a guiding team, getting the right vision, communicating for buy-in, empower action, create those short-term wins that you just referenced. Don't let up. So this is about the sustaining part and making it stick. So in terms of those last 2 pieces of Cotter's change model, you have now gone back to your department. You're back on faculty. You stepped away from the position, the leadership position at the university level. So what about sustaining change? Texas A&M certainly has done a lot, and certainly we look to the institution, not just the vet school, but really kind of looking more globally at the work that has happened and gone on there at so many levels. So what do you see on the horizon? And as you now kind of enter your this next chapter for you, how do you see the institution sustaining change?
That's a great question. In fact, one of the candidates that interviewed for my position asked me that very same question too as well. I think one of the things that I would hope, and I think one of the ways of sustaining change is constantly monitoring what you're doing. And I think assessing what you're doing, assessing your efforts. I mean, how do you know that what you're doing is actually impacting change? And I think adapting new strategies, and I think never losing sight of accountability. You know, when our former provost, and she's a brainchild, you know, for the diversity plan, when we started to look at previous diversity plans that we had at Texas A&M, and where this current one that we have that was instituted in 2010, one of the things that we kept hearing from faculty, staff, and students is who's holding who accountable. Faculty were pointing, you know, at their department chair or deans. The department chair or the heads were pointing at the dean. The dean was pointing at the provost, so you can see up along the administrative chain. So never losing sight of accountability, but also remembering individual accountability. And I think sustaining change over time, particularly leading diversity and inclusion change efforts, I think, I'm going to be honest, it can be exhausting work, especially with all that we have discussed so far. But I think you can also sustain change by working with allies on and off campus. You know, and hope that when you do have systemic change occurring in your culture, is also thinking about leadership succession, because that's one of the keys. You know, people always say, well, you know, how long? I mean, we have a great dean, we have a great department chair, but you know, when that person leaves, what's going to happen? So the true test, I think, of any change efforts is when leaders come and go for whatever reason, is that whatever you have developed in that organizational culture, it becomes part of the artifact, part of what you've created. So now you have people who share the vision and the sense of urgency, and hopefully it will be there for years to come for other faculty and staff and students.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions I didn't include on my question list before. So what kinds of books or media, whether they're, I'm clearly a huge podcast person. I listen to a lot of podcasts, but certainly, literature on this topic in terms of leading change with respect to diversity and inclusion. What kinds of, what have you read that has been really kind of earth-shaking things? What kinds of media would you recommend folks really kind of look into, dive into, and, put on their bookshelf or plug in their car?
Oh, wow. Geez, there's so many books that I like. I'm trying to think here. Okay, let me answer it this way. If I think about course and curricular change, one of the books that was very helpful for me over the years and helpful for me to engage with faculty in particular around teaching and diversity issues is Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good book if we're talking about courses and curricula. If we're talking about faculty recruitment and retention in higher ed, just broadly speaking, wow, I'm trying to think here. Maybe Faculty Diversity by Joanne Moody. I think that's also helpful. If we want to learn more about institutions and culture, and organizational culture, understanding conflict, my colleague, who's the lead author on this book, Nancy Watson, Conflict Management and Dialogue in Higher Education, just came out this year. I would highly recommend that. And another book too that's very helpful. One of our sociology professors here on campus, who's well known in studying race issues in higher education, and a nationally known sociologist. His name is Joe Fagan, F-E-A-G-I-N, and his book on systemic racism is very helpful for those who want to understand issues about specifically about race. But the Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice cuts across all human dimensions of diversity. Those are some that come immediately to mind.
All right, great. I have just dropped the, you can find Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. I think that the publisher is, I think it's Routledge Textbooks. I've just dropped that into our Facebook podcast page, so you can find that there. I will post links to other books and resources on the podcast page as well. One of the podcasts that I've come to listen to on a regular basis is NPR's Code Switch, which really kind of delves into issues around diversity. Sometimes it's race, sometimes it's language, very often culture. There's some really interesting discussions about contemporary issues in diversity and inclusion. So I'll also put some posts there. So what change management advice would you give to a new dean?
A new dean?
Sure.
One of the biggest things I learned in administration that I can't say enough about is, if you're leading change efforts, just leading change in general, not necessarily only about diversity and inclusion, but if you're leading change efforts, is leading change strategically. Be strategic about what you're doing. You can't be all things to all people. And you can't accomplish everything. You know, I remember one of our former presidents, whom we all know, Robert Gates, that served here as president and went on to Washington, D.C. One of the things, when he came here as our president, you know, he looked at our Vision 2020 document that was created in the early 1990s, and there are 12 imperatives for Texas A&M, you know, to be a leading university. And he looked at those 12 imperatives and he said, you know, we can't do all 12 all at one time, but he focused on 3 or 4. And he said, this is what we're going to do. And this is what we're going to aim for. So I would offer that. And to me, that's leading strategically. I think another thing to do is to think about as a leader, if you're a new dean, is lead with a courageous heart. And I say that because just looking at what's happening around us in our society, in our world, you know, and our college campuses are a microcosm of what's happening in our society. Faculty, staff, and students, and particularly our students, they're seeing what's being played out around us. You know, and they're looking to higher education, broadly speaking, for us to help them make sense of what's happening in our society and world. So I think it's important for us to be, as leaders, to lead with a courageous heart and recognizing that decisions you're going to make, you're not going to please everybody. You know, one of the things that I've learned is, you know, if I'm able to sleep fairly good at night, you know, after I make a decision, knowing that, you know, a couple people are going to be unhappy, but it's for the good of the organization and good of the organizational culture. And I think treat people the way you would want to be treated. And treat people the way you want to be treated, always. And I think about that. I think about that a lot, and I think about that, you know, in the context of the leadership experiences that I've had, not only as a vice president, but you know, at the college level, at the department level over the years. You know, so I would offer that. And if you're working through change efforts, make no mistake, change is going to raise fear in people. That's natural. I mean, the research tells you that. It's going to create conflict. You know, but change can also lead to organizational growth and effectiveness, and it can make the organization being defined of a college or a department a better place. So that's what I would offer.
Great. And so one last question, because we have so many student leaders. We have student groups like Voice and Broad Spectrum, both of are diversity, veterinary student diversity groups, and certainly a whole section of SAVMA, which is the student ABMA, really kind of working on these issues. And oftentimes there are certainly some places where students feel like they're doing the heaviest of heavy lifts and driving change while at the bottom, right? And so what advice would you give to these young professionals who will be out in the workforce soon, but are kind of toiling in the academic vineyard at the moment?
Well, before I give the advice, you know, I would say that one of the things that we can do, you know, as faculty and as administrators, is to support those student organizations. And I say that because I remember almost a year and a half ago, I had the opportunity to engage a couple of our veterinary students before I gave a talk to a regional group of one of the AAVMC in, I think, at the University of Florida. Anyway, and I remember engaging a group of veterinary students, and some of them were engaged in those very organizations that you described. And one of the things that they said to me was, you know, they would like more faculty and student support and engagement in the organization. You know, so even though those organizations were created for a reason to provide support for certain groups of students who often feel marginalized, you know, I think the more we support them publicly, not just privately, I think is very helpful. So I'll say that. Now, for the student leaders, you know, who are going out there, you know, who are engaging in those groups, one of the things that I would say, you know, and offer is to really work to understand your own skill set around how you engage in dialogue with others, and really work to listen for perspective taking. Because I see a lot of people right now who are engaging, you know, in dialogues and conversations, you know, who are coming at it, and sometimes coming at a place, and I get it, but oftentimes not well thought out, and there's a lot of emotions that are with those ideas and whatever. So I say that to really work, if you really want people to engage and to listen, then really work to understand yourself and others in the process of engaging in dialogue if you want to bring about change.
It's good advice. Good advice for not just students, but for all of us.
Yep.
Yeah. So as we get ready to draw this episode of Diversity and Inclusion on Air to a close, my parting question is, so what will you be working on now?
Well, I just finished a manuscript looking at what we have learned and assessed about the change efforts around diversity that we've seen in the last 6 years of engaging with this new diversity plan. So I've just finished that. I'm also working with another colleague of mine, looking at how do we look at change efforts with respect to leaders around big change efforts, not necessarily diversity. So we hope to interview some key leaders on college and university campuses around that, and have them reflect on what they're doing, and maybe engaging with us in a conversation, and hopefully documenting some of that stuff so other people can learn from, and hopefully share those best practices. And a couple of colleagues of mine at the University of Maryland and others were convening in January with the president there to look at diversity and inclusion efforts more broadly at colleges and universities. And I'm not sure what's going to come out of those dialogues yet, but they're engaging what they're calling thought leaders around the country to think about the work that we do in college and universities, particularly predominantly research universities, and how do we move those efforts in a more intentional way.
Exciting stuff. So we will definitely be on the lookout, and I will definitely be sharing some of those publications as they come out. So good luck to you.
Thank you.
All right. So that is going to wrap this episode of Diversity and Inclusion on Air. Thank you, everyone, this year for all of your support of this podcast. We look forward to coming back and finishing up our third season beginning in January. So with that, we will wish you all season's greetings, happy holidays, and an early Happy New Year, and we will see you next year. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and happy holidays, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.